Hello, 7th grade. So we've been talking about genetics. We started that unit last week, and we talked about Mendel's experiment. So I want to review that experiment just a little bit, and then get into talking about dominant and recessive alleles. So Mendel's experiment, if you remember, we did this on page 28 of your science notebook. And Mendel's experiment was, so we took two plants, tall and short. Purebred tall, purebred short. That means for many generations, there was really tall plants on this side, and for many generations, there were short plants for this plant. Okay, and you cross them together, and their babies were both tall. Or they'd have, many babies, and they'd all be tall. So, that's interesting because there's a short parent there, so why are all the children tall? Okay, keep that question in mind. So then he crosses these, and he gets about 75%, or 75% would be tall, and 25% would be short. So this is what happened in his experiment. Now it's time to make sense of that. How is that possible, and why is that happening? Which is how we think in science. So what we've talked about already, and we talked about this very end, was that each living thing gets one factor from one parent and another factor from another parent and comes together, and then the baby has these two factors from the parent and from the mom and the dad of the parent. That makes sense. So everything has something from the mom and something from the dad in their bodies. And we also talked about how sometimes one of those factors masks the other. So, for example, in this example here, you have a tall parent and a short parent come together, and all of their children were tall. So the idea that one trait could one factor from a parent could mask another is saying that maybe in these plants, there's stuff saying that they're short. It has the codes to make short things inside of these plants, but all that's being shown is the tallness. So that shortness was just masked over. So the short factor, you have the short factor, the tall factor, and the tall factor was masking the short one. And so all you see is the tall. Although there might still be codes in here to make short plants, even in that generation where everything's tall. So that's what we talked about last time, maybe not in that much detail, but this is the focus for today. So it's okay if you're confused up to this point, but this should bring a lot of clarity by the end of the day. So the first thing I want to talk about is, instead of factors, I'm going to start using words like genes and alleles. So what is that? Let's get started. So let's say that's a cell. I've drawn a circle. Inside the cell, you have a nucleus. It's the part of the cell that hosts what? It hosts DNA. So here I have, this is a chromosome, that little X there. That is called a chromosome. Inside chromosomes, so we have the cell, the nucleus, and then in nuclei, plural, in nuclei of cells, we have chromosomes, and they look like these little X's. So in these chromosomes are entirely composed of something called DNA. So I'm going to take a section of this chromosome, so I'm boxing it in purple, that little section of this chromosome. I'm going to take it out here and finish drawing it up there. Let me bring this a little closer. Okay, so I have the cell, nucleus. Inside the nucleus is a chromosome. I've taken a section of that chromosome. We're going to draw it over here, just so we have more space. Actually, that's right where the glare is, so we're going to draw it over there. Okay, so what are chromosomes made of? They're made of DNA. So all of these chromosomes, all it is a bunch of stuff called DNA. And so DNA looks like this. It's these double helix. That's what these structures are called, double helixes. And they could be so long. So this is what that little section would be zoomed in. We zoom in on this little section, and what you'd find is a bunch of DNA. A bunch of little squiggly lines look like this. But this DNA has the codes for how everything is made, how everything is reproduced. Anything you could really think of, you need DNA. So to say, like, why do you have brown eyes? Well, it's in your DNA. It's in those cells, in each of your cells. So you have the cell, nucleus, chromosome. Chromosomes are made of, what did we call this? DNA. DNA. Now, I'm going to take out another section. So in this DNA, if I just take a little section of DNA, so the way that we took a little section of the chromosome, I'm going to take a little section of a piece of DNA. So maybe just right here. So you can hardly tell, but I boxed that little bit of DNA right there. I'm going to bring this even closer. So in that DNA, that little section, I'm going to draw a line of it. This is the little line of DNA we're talking about. So this is it just zoomed in. So what I've done is I've taken this little section of the chromosome and zoomed in, and what do you see? A bunch of DNA. So now I'm taking a little section of a piece of DNA and zooming in, and I just have this little line here. So this is a little line of DNA. Now, that little line is going to have pieces that make it a code for something. So let's say this code says GTA. Let's just say that's a code. Pretend that's a code. I'm not going to go into what all of that stuff means, but let's just say this is the code here. All right. So this little section of DNA that has a code, it gives you a code to tell the offspring what trait it should be. So, or what trait this thing, the organism that's holding the cell, has. So, what is a trait? A trait is the thing that you can see physically. So, for example, eye color would be a trait. And then, so if we're going to say eye color, for example, let's do that. So, eye color is the trait. And then this little code of DNA is called a gene. And this gene is going to tell me what color the eye is. So the trait, I'll say trait, it's the thing we're talking about. The broad scheme of things, the big thing we're talking about, which was eye color. The gene is the code that's going to tell me what eye color we're talking about. So I'm going to call this gene. This little piece of DNA is called a gene. And this gene, I said it controls for a certain trait. So it tells you the information that's going to link this, the DNA, to what eye color you're getting. Or if it's height you're talking about, this little thing, this gene, is going to tell me if we're talking about short or tall. Gives you the code that you're looking for. So that section, when I'm talking about genes, I'm talking about the part of DNA. That little tiny part of DNA that gives you a code for what something's going to look like. So remember that. Gene, little part of DNA that tells me what something's going to look like. That tells me the trait is what something's going to look like, right? So that's what a gene is. Now, not everyone has the same genes. How do I know that? Nobody looks the same. And I mean, there's just so much diversity in the world. Even thinking about plants, you have tall plants, short plants, pink flowers, yellow flowers, and they're the same plant, same type of plant, but they have different colors. like hydrangeas. You can get blue hydrangeas, white hydrangeas. So there must be something in their DNA that says something different, but everything else is similar enough that you get the same exact plant. So a blue hydrangea and a white hydrangea, you know, they're both hydrangeas. So their DNA must be similar enough that it's giving you the same shape plant. The same plant does the same thing, reacts the same way to sun and water and everything. But the genes are different because they're getting different colors. So there's little parts of the DNA from a blue plant, a blue hydrangea and a white hydrangea. That little part of the DNA that's different is the gene, the code of the DNA that's going to tell you how something looks different, which will explain for the differences within plants. Okay, so that's genes. Now, like I said, everything has different genes. Now, let's say, so we have the cell here with nucleus and everything there. Let's say we have another cell, and inside that cell there's the nucleus, and in that cell there's the chromosome, and in that cell, even in there there's the DNA, and then inside the DNA there's the gene, and then this cell mixes with this cell, and you know, this cell has its own gene. Well, then their offspring, so we're gonna breed these two cells here, and we have this gene and we have this gene, and let's say instead of GTA, this one is TGA. So they're different, but they're coding for the same thing. We're talking about eye color. So they're coding for the same thing, but they're different. So these two genes, we have this gene and this gene, we want to bring them together. Oops. See down here, I'm running out of space. But we bring them together, and you're going to have a mixture of these two. But is it really mixture? No. That's what we're talking about. So one of these, either GTA or TGA, one of these genes is going to mask the other. So when you have offspring, we'll just make a box down here, and we'll call this the offspring. We have offspring. These two genes, although they were genes for these organisms, are going to be called alleles. So they get one allele from this parent and one from this parent. So you also have one allele from one parent and one allele from another. Okay, so that is genes and alleles. Now, I'm going to explain using this book and talk about it one at a time, and maybe this will be helpful too. Okay. Today, scientists use the word gene for the factors that control a trait. So, scientists use the word gene. So we talked about what genes are. For the factors that control a trait. So these genes tell you what a trait is going to be. Alleles are the different forms of a gene. So see how these have different forms? That means they're alleles. So genes is that section of the DNA that's going to code for a trait, but the fact that they have differences, so the two differences here, that makes them alleles, the two differences. Okay. Alleles are the different forms of a gene. The gene that controls stem height in peas, for example, has one allele for tall stems and one allele for short stems. Each pea plant inherits two alleles from its parents, one allele from the egg and the other from the sperm. A pea plant may inherit two alleles for tall stems, two alleles for short stems, or one of each. Okay, so it's talking back to Mendel's experiment, and it's saying, let me turn to the page, that, for example, this generation here, F1 generation, is going to have the allele for tall plants and the allele for short plants, because it gets one allele from one parent and one allele from the next parent. So each of these has those genes, that DNA, like I was talking about, It has one allele from each parent. That's all we've got so far. So these are two different codes. One code is telling you to be short, one code's telling you to be tall, but they're both talking about height. Height is the trait, and then you have tallness, shortness, the two different types of height. And then you have the allele for tallness and shortness, and the allele for tallness and shortness here. So, that's all that we've talked about so far. Continuing on. An organism's traits are controlled by the alleles it inherits from its parents. Some alleles are dominant, while other alleles are recessive. Note that. I'll read it again. An organism's traits are controlled by the alleles it inherits from its parents. So the way you look depends on the alleles that both of your parents gave you. So you got one from one parent, one from another parent. The way you look depends on what they've given you. Okay, some alleles are dominant while others are recessive. What does that mean? A dominant allele is one whose trait always shows up in the organism when the allele is present. A recessive allele, on the other hand, is hidden whenever the dominant allele is present. A trait controlled by a recessive allele will only show up if the organism does not have the dominant allele. Figure 3, so I'll show you. Figure 3 shows dominant and recessive alleles in Mendel's crosses. Okay, so we don't need to worry about figure 3. I'm going to use it explaining this. All figure 3 is talking about is this interaction here. So a dominant allele, when there's a dominant allele present, it hides anything that could show up for the recessive allele. So let's look at this. So we have pure tall and pure short. I'm going to use this pencil, pure tall and pure short. So we're talking about height, so I'm going to use capital H and lower h to represent these alleles, just so we're on the same page. So this capital H represents pure tallness, and this lowercase h represents shortness. So these children are going to have one from each parent. They'll have an H and a lower h, and an uppercase H and a lower h. Each parent has given them one of their alleles. So let me just fill it in a little more. You don't have to write this, but I want you to follow along. So we have pure tall, pure short, big H, little h. Now each of their kids is going to receive an allele from each. So remember, these are representing the alleles. So now each kid has tall and short in it, tall and short in it. But all of these children turned out tall. Well, why would that happen? It's because that tallness allele is dominating the shortness one. It's called a dominant allele. It's hiding that shortness characteristic. So when that dominant allele is present, it's as if physically looking at it, the shortness one wasn't even there. So yes, all of this generation here had that recessive allele, that little h representing shortness. It had it in its blood, in its DNA, in its genes, but it didn't show up physically, even though it was present. Why? Because that dominant allele, that tallness allele, just walked right over it and made it hidden. Okay, so that's all for today for dominant and recessive alleles. Remember, dominant masks the recessive allele. So here, tallness is dominant, shortness is recessive, and the dominant trait masks the recessive trait or recessive allele. Okay, so that's all for today. Let me know if you have questions on that. I know that's a lot of information to take in. But try to remember what a gene is, what an allele is, and what it means for something to be dominant or recessive. And And that's all for today.